Today's show is sponsored by Okta. In these challenging times, we're all looking for simplicity, something that just works. The last thing you want to do is spend time building authentication for your new curbside pickup app. Because if you're spending time building your own authentication systems, it's time spent not making your customers happy. This is where Okta makes it simple. Okta's cloud-based authentication services are easy to set up, and they already integrate with the tools and applications you use today. Okta is trusted by companies like HPE, Splunk, CarMax, GitLab, and Cengage, plus many, many more. To take the hassle out of your authentication needs, visit okta.com/cloud and learn how to get started today. That's okta.com/cloud.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Welcome to 2021, everybody. We finally made it through 2020, the 12, 15, 18 months of March that was 2020. Glad to be through it. Glad everybody is hopefully had a good holiday season, got through the new year, and we're excited to bring you a whole new set of 2021 shows. This is our 10th year. Actually, that was our 10th year that we just finished. We're just finishing up 10 years of recording the show. Very excited to continue to bring it to you. And really, we're going to kind of cut Cloud News of the Week short this week. There's not a whole lot that's been announced this week. Just a couple of things I want to kind of remind folks of. We have a great show coming up. We're going to really dig into some really interesting topics, our look-ahead shows for the month of January. But just a couple of things I want to remind folks of. If you are not looking at the things that involve the SolarWinds hack, please go look at that in your business. Make sure that you're following all the best practices to get that patch. That seems like a very nasty thing. If you're not working on that, we'll put some things in the show notes about that. Also, if you didn't get a chance to maybe catch the year-end show that we did for 2020 and you're just picking up 2021, one thing you will notice, we did include a show earlier in the week called Cloudcast Basics. That is a new series that we're going to do. They won't be in this feed every week. We just put it in for the one time. But that's a series of sort of seasonal shows that Aaron and I are going to do to really help our community that wants to be new to cloud computing. So if you could do us a favor, if you could tell your friends, tell your coworkers, tell your colleagues, maybe tell your boss, anybody who's new to cloud computing about Cloudcast Basics, they can get it. Just search for Cloudcast Basics anywhere that you get podcasts. You'll be able to find that. But we're looking forward to putting that out. Season 0 is out there. Season 1 will be out very soon, and then we will probably do those on a monthly basis. So with that, I'm going to wrap up Cloud News of the Week. Very excited to talk about hybrid and multi-cloud in our session coming up just in a second. And with that, we're going to get to the break. Today's show is sponsored by BMC, and BMC wants to know, is your business on its A game? The A game is when systems are intelligent by learning from markets, where automation is paramount yet effortless, and when technology and people work as one in an enterprise. The A game is your business at its absolute best. BMC calls this the autonomous digital enterprise. Find out more at bmc.com/agame. That's bmc.com/agame. Today's show is sponsored by Datadog, a cloud-scale monitoring platform that unifies metrics, logs, and traces from technologies like Istio, AppMesh, and Envoy. Plus, Datadog's Service Map automatically plots out the dependencies in your microservices architectures for seamless, context-rich troubleshooting. With rich visualizations, algorithmic alerting, and more than 250 vendor-supported integrations, Datadog allows you to monitor your distributed applications in real time. Start a free 14-day trial today by visiting datadog.com/cloudcast. And Datadog will send you a great free t-shirt. That's datadog.com/cloudcast. And we're back. And folks, it is good to be back in 2021. It's good to be back with everybody. And, you know, as we've done for the last couple of years, we're going to start off this year with a series of shows in January for what we call look aheads. And we always try and pick some fairly big topics, and we try and grab some guests who we know have not only sort of deep experience in these things, but also some pretty hard-earned opinions about where these big topics are going. So very excited today to not only talk about sort of hybrid and multi-cloud, but very excited to have friend of the show, Brandon Whichard, who is both product manager at DXC, but maybe just as importantly is co-host of Software Defined Talk, one of our favorite shows. Brandon, welcome to the show. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Brian. Good to be back. Always good to be back on the Cloudcast.
Yeah, it's good to have you back. So before we dive into this hybrid cloud thing, give us a little bit about what you do, sort of day job, why hybrid cloud impacts that, but then also where are you guys going with Software Defined Talk? Where can people find it? Where's all the goodness from you and Matt and Cote?
Yeah, well, thanks again for having us on the show. And so, day job wise, I'm over at GXC Technology, and I think I am officially an offering manager because the product manager title, that's been retired now. So, my day to day life is I just spend time with clients and customers, basically trying to help them migrate to the cloud. So we just kind of think of it as you have workloads, infrastructure residing anywhere, could be your old data centers, could be public clouds, could be anywhere in the world. And we spend a lot of time trying to figure out and help those clients move those workloads to wherever they want it to go. So that can be on premise still in VMware, it could be to all the major hyperscalers, AWS, Google, things like that. So we spend a lot of time talking to clients about what they're doing, always learn about all their crazy environments. And then hopefully, if we're successful, we give them some good advice about how to get those workloads where they want them to go. So always a fun place to work, always exciting things happening. Yeah. And then on Software Defined Talk, as you said, definitely a podcast. I don't know where we're going. I don't think we ever necessarily have a plan, but we do shows weekly. I think Cloudcast, right? Cloudcast maybe owns your Wednesdays, but hopefully one day Software Defined Talk for all your listeners can own your Fridays. So that's a weekly roundup with me and my two co-hosts of all the news in cloud, enterprise technology, and then quite a bit of nonsense as well. So if you're looking for another podcast on Fridays, check it out.
Yeah, well, and you guys have a couple of unique aspects. One, you're in 3 different continents, so there's always an international flavor to it. And then, Matt Ray comes from the automation world and sort of the tinkering with everything world. Cote comes from the application and culture and DevOps world, and then you come from sort of a lot of security and identity management. So you guys always have a kind of a broad perspective on all the stuff. So it's always a good listen. We highly recommend it. Let's dive into this hybrid cloud thing. It's weird. So 10 years ago, every hardware and software vendor that was out there was kind of using hybrid cloud for 2 reasons. One, I think they were using it to kind of buffer this kind of nascent pending public cloud thing, right? This idea that, everybody's going to kind of get out of their data center. And then they were using it, as a reality thing, which was, people aren't going to move all of their applications out of their data centers for any time soon, right? And this goes 10 years back. The public cloud pushed back on this really hard. It was, you couldn't say hybrid cloud in an AWS event. You couldn't mention those sort of things. And then this year at reInvent, the 2 magic words came out. Hybrid cloud became a real thing. So like, where are we? How did we get from, 10 years ago, it was half the industry bought into it. And now, all the public cloud providers are buying into it. Like how have we gotten to where we are?
Yeah, well, I think that's an excellent, question. And I think what you hit on there is, I think we have to start with Andy Jassy, right? Of course, the GM CEO of AWS. And as I like to refer to him as the Nick Saban of cloud computing. So Nick Saban being the famous Alabama football coach here in the U.S. And the reason I say that is Nick Saban, I will not belabor this sports metaphor too much longer, but I'll just say Nick Saban used to just be from play good defense and, you'd win national championships. But a few years ago, he learned, and even he relented, that he needs to have a great offense. And of course, now he's embraced that. And I think, Andy Jassy has had an equal epiphany, if I may say so, is that, and I actually went back and I looked at his quote when he was introducing hybrid cloud in this year's keynote, right? And he said, quote, "The vast majority of companies in the fullness of time will not have their own data centers." And I think that is quite the change from just a few years ago, where it's like, hey, there's only public cloud. Anybody that's thinking about doing anything else is crazy. But even AWS, even Andy Jassy has acknowledged that, yes, there definitely is a place for on-premise infrastructure for lots of reasons. And I think even this quote about the fullness of time, I just think is somewhat funny. It's like, well, given infinite time, like almost anything is possible. But I think really where we are today, and I think kind of setting the stage for a lot of this conversation is like, hey, it has to start with the conversation. And even Jassy kind of references this, is that the world is largely virtualized. Most of today's workloads today are running in some form of VMware. And that, when I talk to clients, most of the time, that's always where we're starting. It's something like, I have this amount of VMs and they're running these types of applications. What should I do? And I think that's typically where every customer starts with today.
Yeah. No, I agree. And it sort of falls into, typically when I talk to people, it's one of 3 buckets, right? It's the thing that's driving all of our meetings these days is reduce cost, right? So maybe we get out of the cloud, or we get into the cloud because we think, that's going to reduce costs because we're going to be paying, now numbers that start at cents per hour, right? And people generally can't do the math in their head, so they just assume that's cheaper. The second one is like, there's a mandate that we have to go cloud first, right? So there's some reason to do it. There's a regulatory reason, there's whatever. And then the third one, which gets all the headlines, but typically is the smallest amount of the spend, is we got to build something new, right? Not migrate, not modernize, but like we got to build something new, and we'd like to take advantage of this innovation that happens to be in the cloud. And so we're not even thinking about the old stuff anymore. Like we're this separate group. Like, do you find other buckets than those, or are those typically the buckets you find that people have to deal with?
I think that's generally true. I think you also can throw in some other ones is just, we have, the number one reason I think a lot of times people are just trying to do any type of migration is the thing they're running is about to run out of support, like, Microsoft Windows. And it's like, they just haven't done anything. So that's like, that isn't so much a strategic decision as it is more like, oh my gosh, we just find out that it's finally over. They're finally not even going to let us pay more money for support. And then I think you always have the mainframe, right? You always have that sitting out there too, with some legacy applications that are truly legacy, like, 10, 20, 30 years old that people are always trying to figure out what do we do next with. But, all of these conversations, and I think you hit on it first, is like many times people will say something like, oh, we'll take all these VMs. And sometimes they we like to call it rehost, but sometimes they'll call it lift and shift. And they'll say something like, well, that's what they often think they want. They're like, we'll just move all of this to one of the public cloud providers, and it'll be great because our CIOs all over us to like move to the cloud. And whenever they do that, I must have this conversation once a week. I always tell them like, all right, if we do this, it is almost surely going to cost you more money. I just want you to know that going in, because we've had multiple clients do it, and then they get like that sticker shock, right? And the reason is most of the time is they're in a rush and they haven't had the chance to rationalize those workloads. So that's like, I think is like the most common mistake today is someone saying, I just want to embrace the public cloud. Maybe they watched the AWS keynote and they're like, this is it. This is what we have to do. But you mentioned it there, cents per day or cents per minute, however you want to bill it. It actually turns out that it actually racks up quite quickly. Those bills get very, very large, and it can be shocking to customers. So that's like, to me, that's every conversation I always say, have you really thought it through? And especially, telling them like, we probably don't want to move everything at once. And we probably want to look at each one of these workloads very carefully before we just start throwing it up on the public cloud. And you call me all upset that I told you to do that.
Right. Well, and you also realize that there's like, the cloud makes this assumption that you're sort of aware of everything that impacts your application or that your infrastructure. And you start realizing like, yeah, when I put applications in my data center, I don't necessarily think about how much the network costs. I don't necessarily think about WAN costs or internet costs or whatever. I just go, I bought some servers, I bought some storage, I plug them in, I wrestle with somebody over IP addresses, but I don't worry about it. And, and then you hear horror stories, and I don't want to turn this into a, bash the public cloud thing, but like you hear these stories of like, oh, we had no idea that, routing traffic between availability zones costs money, or we had no idea that, leaving this GPU on for a week was going to be this enormous number. So yeah, it's there's a reason why there's an entire industry of people that are, either cloud cost management companies or cloud economists right. or any of those sort of things. Like it's a real thing. So
yeah, and I think you're kind of going back to your original question, right? It's like, and I think, the case where it makes a lot of sense is what you were talking about before. It's like, if something is greenfield or very small, you have a very small application, you're just trying to figure it out, or you yourself are a very small company and you're building something new. In most of those cases, like that's probably the case that when we think of cloud computing, that's like when we mentally like actually envision someone, we probably think of like a small group doing something really quickly, building an application. We also think like customer facing. It's like absolutely all of the public clouds. Like right. they're going to give you so many advantages from availability, from thinking of all the things you haven't thought about, security, all the tools, all the ability to scale up and scale down. And 100%, I'd tell anyone, if you're just building some small application on the side, or even you're a relatively small company, or you don't think of yourself as like IT isn't a major function, you're just looking to find a simple way to do it, that's the place, and I think that's the majority of our conversations. Or of course, like the world that we sit in a lot is, for people that are lucky enough to be building large applications and want to use multi-tenant microservices and are very ingrained in Kubernetes. Okay, again, that's another place that obviously, the public cloud is going to make a lot of sense. But, kind of back to even Jassy's opening comments this year, I think we're something like, I think he said something like 5% of today's workloads exist in the public cloud. Right. And what he's not, I think to fill in the other 95%, it's not 95% of the workloads of small companies building new apps or like being done on premise. It's like, no, 95% of those apps exist in very large corporations, likely running on, traditional infrastructure, mainframe, VMware, all the things we know and love. And most of those applications are going to be difficult to move. I mean, that's kind of the other part of that sentence that people don't forget. And that's why it isn't going to happen overnight, right? Like, I think sometimes when he says that, it's just like, oh, it'll just keep ticking down. It's like, no, every percentage point down, those applications get more and more complicated to move. Hence, that's why they stay where they are.
Right. Yeah. It's not porting your cell phone number. It's not, moving your 401k. It's like, it's moving to a different country, kind of difficult sometimes. And so here's the other thing that that now that we're, literally a decade into sort of talking about this thing, you've talked about it in various places that you sort of live with it. What are some of the, 3 or 4 big misconceptions that you still hear people, assuming are going to happen if they go, we're going to do hybrid or multi-cloud, or, like that's the approach we're trying to take. Like, what do you find people stumble with beyond the, hey, we put it in there, it's expensive, but like, what are these, you still like for example, like I hear this misperception all the time that, 10 years in, people are still like, yeah, we're going to burst into the cloud. We're going to kind of just use the dynamic stuff. We're going to burst applications. And I'm like, all right, that doesn't happen anywhere ever. Like it's sort of like, that's sort of like the Bigfoot
this
thing.
Magic elasticity. It's not just happening.
Yeah. What do you find sometimes that you're just like, you want to stop people in the middle of their sentence and go, you're not going to get that?
Yeah, well, I think, cost, we already hit on that one, so we won't believe, but I think that's one, and that's that's like way, way ahead. I think people always think they're going to save more money than they can. 2 is really the learning curve, right? I think that's the next thing. It's like, people, like, let's just take VMware, right? VMware has a passionate set of users that love VMware and are so familiar with the VMware consoles, and VMware, very complicated product, very powerful, of course, but people have invested, think about 10 years, maybe even longer, like their whole career is becoming experts in this. And so when you tell somebody, okay, we're going to move this over to any of the public clouds, it just requires, just like you have to be really smart and have to really have taken some time to learn VMware. It's the same thing with all of the public cloud providers. Like, they all have very robust certification programs. When you get into them and you're trying to do really production level things, the AWS console, specifically, right? I mean, that is, it's both the most powerful thing that exists today, and it's probably the most complicated one, right? Yeah. So that's a huge thing when people get into it. They either underestimate, like, oh, I'll just get in there and I'll just, figure out how to do it, or they haven't accounted for, like, I need to hire people, just like I hired a VMware expert, right? I need to have AWS experts on hand, whether that be the people they build in-house, they can contract with employees like, my employer would certainly be there to help you. Lots of other managed service providers would be out there to help you as well. But I think that's a huge thing that people just don't understand the learning curve that's about to go into it. So it's a huge thing that I think people need to take advantage of.
Yeah, I think the last one that I hear a lot is they go, well, we're gonna use a bunch of the clouds, which is, a perfectly valid thing. Like, you may be using Azure for like Office 365 or Teams or something. You may use AWS for stuff. You may use whatever. And there's sort of this belief or this conversation a lot of times of like, we're just going to move apps between them, like the old sort of arbitrage idea. And the thing I always come back to people is I go, okay, like that might happen. And that thinking might have happened when you had sort of these very centralized groups who, half of what they did was a technology decision, half was like vendor management, cost management. But now things are pretty distributed. Like, the finance group will make their own decisions, and marketing makes their own decisions, and, go to, sales does. Like, I tend to tell people, like, the thing you ought to think about in terms of hybrid or, multi, or the way you call your cloud thing, is like, can you be consistent, like, in your process, right? Like, can you, if you're going to have CI and CD pipelines, can you be consistent there? Can you build some sort of consistent way of doing security and auditing? And then, if you end up being in AWS, or you end up being in Azure, or you end up being somewhere else, like those might be movable, but like don't get yourself into this idea that they're just, completely exactly the same. Like that tends to be sort of a problem.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think the most popular use case that often gets talked about that I think in reality is very, very limited in how many times it actually happens. Is the idea that like you're going to move the same exact workload. You're in the same, for one application, you move that workload. You're just going to kind of move it around wherever it's, the cheapest, quote unquote, to optimize cost, right? I think that is probably the use case that is often cited, almost never used, and probably is not really a good goal. Like the place of multi-cloud, like what I think people actually see, like, and you were alluding to it before, was multi-cloud is like very large organizations of all kinds will end up picking different providers just for different things, just based on preference, because there's some specific thing that they're trying to do. And they feel like one specific of the public cloud providers is better at. Sometimes that's geographic location. Sometimes that's relationships. Sometimes that's contracting. Sometimes it's a very specific piece of technology.
Yeah.
And especially like the databases and stuff like that. Right. If you're going to stay with SQL Server, right? Like maybe you're probably going to go Azure SQL, right? Or, vice versa, if something else. So that's multi-cloud, right? And I talk to clients all the time that are talking to me, and they'll tell me like one group is doing this and one group is doing that, and they're using different ones. And then that's what they do. The ones that are smart about it are just focused in on like, hey, we just have to have a common way to manage all of this. We're not going to, if you will, mandate everybody pick one cloud provider. Now, it's nice when that happens, but you get in any relatively large organization out there, you're going to find a couple different clouds, if not all the major cloud providers represented in some way.
Right. Yeah. Well, at some point, that's how your data centers look today. That's very likely what your cloud choices will look like in the future too. There's a reason people.
It's like monitoring. At some point, you have all the monitoring tools, and it is true. You will one day have maybe all the clouds.
Yep. So in terms of sort of what's so certain things have worked relatively well. You can go to most vendors today, whether they're cloud providers or they're software vendors or whatever, and you can say, hey, look. I want to get your technology somewhat consistent between running it in the public cloud, whether it's I deploy the software or it's a managed service or what I can get on-prem. And like that consistency thing is fairly far along, right? It's relatively mature. But like, what are some of the areas that if you're looking at, hybrid or multi-cloud and you're going like, these are the other big gaps, right? So like, I know you spend a lot of time around identity management and security. And so like, what are some of those areas where you're like, these things are pretty good, but over here is still either landmines or, uncharted territory?
Well, I think, all the providers are pretty much, if you think about it, compute, storage, networking, or just, we'll lump all that together and call that infrastructure as a service. All the top public cloud providers, I think they have figured that out. It's going to work. They would all say they have distinct differences, and they do. But generally, that is the cornerstone of all of these offerings at this point. Where you start to see things get, more complicated is when people want to step up and start taking advantage of different services. And it can be anything, right? Like everything from, AWS is a very specific identity and access management kind of structure, right? So depending on, what you're trying to do, it can probably be done with AWS, but it probably is going to require you to think of IAM in a different way. Same thing with all of the Kubernetes services, right? So ECS, EKS, all of this stuff, GKE, they're all like nuanced in how they actually work. So, and then of course, in the database side, right? All of the providers have some type of, hosted database offering. They all will claim that they're defeating Oracle, right? Because Oracle is the big bad wolf in that world, right? But of course, Oracle, who often is the centerpiece of getting beat on in these things, is like the Oracle databases has an incredible amount of intellectual property inside of them that people tend to can overlook, right? It's like it's not so easy to just move off that for Postgres. So when you get into all of these areas and you say, I want to move everything, it's sort of that next level up, databases, some of the specific services, everyone's about AI now. That's a really immature area to me, right? It's sort of like still being figured out. And that's where I think, clients that want to take advantage of a specific type of service for their industry, for their specific applications, if they're going to spend time doing proof of concepts and really figuring out what they want, I always advise them that's the place you really need to vet out, because these services, while they're new and while they're moving fast, a lot of them are not complete, right? And they're missing a lot of different things. So if you haven't gone through and vetted out one of those higher level services, you can find yourself, having done the migration, and then you get there and be very disappointed that something isn't supported or isn't on the roadmap. So that's the area that if caution customers, look very closely at any of these services that you're going to be heavily dependent on.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think the other thing, and we always sort of gloss over it, is, if you're starting off and you're doing architecture, you have to have a little bit of awareness of like, okay, how does AWS work? And then maybe that's your baseline, or how does Azure work? That's your baseline. And then you've got to do a little bit of homework of like, how much different is their other their sort of comparable service, if your goal at some point is to be like, I'm going to use more than one of them, right? Because it's, do you treat them really vanilla, or, like you said, can you dive into them and really get the benefits of kind of the advanced capabilities and features? And, you don't necessarily have to do it right away, but it is worth sort of having some of that kind of cross-functional, cross-cloud knowledge as it's going along. Last question, I'm going to kind of wrap up because I know we're running a little bit out of time. What do you see as stuff that if somebody said, hey, we're moving along, we're making some progress, what are the big areas that kind of need to get improved, in this sort of multi-cloud area? And it doesn't necessarily just need to be sort of the big three clouds. Like, is it things like, better ability to integrate with SaaS applications if they're going to be part of your thing, or, API management or other stuff? Like, what areas do you find that you're like, man, I wish this whole area just, somebody would come in and be the Tesla of this space, because it just needs a kind of an a rethink or a redo?
Yeah, well, I think there's definitely plenty of opportunity there. I think, it's less about maybe one specific area. I think it's more around rethinking what we think about multi-cloud, and rethinking kind of like all of these applications. So, there's been a lot of talk about serverless or functions. And I think, I've heard you say this, and I've heard others say it, and I've started to use the phrase, event-driven architecture, right? So this idea that, hey, if we can get to the point that when we build new applications that are primarily just, throwing off some event, and we can throw that event out, and we can assume that somebody else that wants that event can listen to it, and then they can take some type of, action off it, right? That is really where I think, we're going to see the potential to do some of the things that we've been talking about in the cloud. The idea that you can scale up and down, right? But that's all predicated on people building applications kind of thinking event-driven architecture first, rather than kind of this hard-coded, like the PO, like I process the payment, then I make a call into inventory, and then inventory makes a call into like shipping, right? The idea that like, let's make all of these things events, because as we kind of look forward, that basis of integration, if you think about, hey, I can throw in an event and I can have that trigger an action. Maybe that's an action that's, sitting somewhere like an OpenShift, sitting somewhere in a VMware, sitting somewhere on Azure, GCP, on things like that. Like, that's the world I think we all want to work in. The idea that like, I can just receive events. If I'm built around that, then I do have the ability to, if you will, scale up and down as events come in. I, scale up my infrastructure. I do a bunch of processing. And then when I'm done, right, I can scale down that infrastructure. So as we kind of think about, it's like almost the last 10 years have been like recreating the entire data center inside of all these clouds. And I think when you listen to AWS and others, that's really what they talk about. But where we actually want to go is kind of this event-driven architecture. And I think, whether it's called serverless or Lambda or functions, it's really, for most applications, I think when you get outside of like, gaming and streaming and like processing weather data and all that kind of stuff, outside of these kind of those kind of niche applications, event-driven architectures are the way forward, right? This is that dream that like I do some type of business function, I hand off to someone else, and I don't care where it is. I don't care if it's on-premise in another cloud or something along those lines. So I kind of think in the next 5 years or whatever, that's where we're going to see a lot of build out, making that, if you will, that dream become possible. Yeah.
Well, and I think you and I know you've talked about it a lot. You've been sort of becoming a convert to the serverless and event-driven space. I mean, it does really hit on a couple of things, right? Like the whole serverless space, or functions as a service, is sort of the first time that we truly get on-demand cloud computing and pay for it just what you use. So I mean, like, it's taken us 10 years. We're now at that point. And then you think about like what the event-driven stuff is really ultimately doing. It's basically saying like, look, we used to have to do things like batch because it would have been really expensive to send all this data or to, process a bunch of stuff. Well, now those cost sort of limitations have gone away. I can do stuff in more real time. There's stuff like Kafka, which just makes it easy, so those things that used to drive us to the old architectures weren't bad at the time. They just were the limitations of what we had. Now there's these things now that allow us to do it at scale and at reasonable cost. And, people are impatient and they want stuff, all the time, 24/7. So yeah, I think that's a really good sort of outlook. Coincidentally, and I didn't mean to set you up for the question this way, I think next week's show, we're actually going to do around event-driven stuff. So we'll dive into that in a little more detail. Hey, let me ask you one last question, because one of the things that you guys do on your show that I like all the time is you talk about Legacy Conf, which is the imaginary event that you guys are going to host at some point with all the stuff that nobody likes to talk about but runs everybody's business. Anything getting a new track this year for Legacy Conf that you guys can see? Is VDI getting a track, or is there a new Windows version getting a track at Legacy Conf this year?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I don't know, like new tracks, things are coming out. I don't know. Maybe we have to start to throw in our Mesosphere or DockerCon. I don't know. Those are still maybe two still new.
But at this point.
But yeah, I mean, I would say, maybe that's the thing we need to look at is like some of the early, container orchestration attempts. And, the very early stuff like that would probably, I don't know if it's kind of like a Hall of Fame. I don't know if it's been retired for 5 years, but we would maybe be looking at that, like Docker Swarm and other things. But it is funny, right? Today's, hot new technology, all the things we're just talking about, right? It's as you know, and as everyone listening to this knows, like it doesn't take that long to feel old. Like you think 5 years ago, you're like, oh, a lot of that stuff we don't even worry about anymore. But it stays on forever, as we always joke about Legacy Conf. It never really dies. It's Flash finally retired after all this time. It's finally over for Flash, but that took probably a decade in the making.
Yeah. They were going to kill it off with the original iPhone, and it took 10 years. So, Yep. Boys and girls, if you're new to this stuff, anything that you're working on now will be around for a very long time. It's like cockroaches and Twinkies and stuff. It just never dies. So,
amen.
Well, cool. Well, Brandon, as always, it's great to have you on. Thank you for, kind of going around the world with us around hybrid cloud, and give a plug for where folks can find, you're obviously not going out to events, but like, where can they find Software Defined Talk and, kind of catch up with what you're doing?
Yeah, well, just everyone go in your podcast player right now. Go search for Software Defined Talk. Like we said, we release a show every day. I'm sorry, not every day, once a week on Fridays. And you can go out to www.softwaredefinedtalk.com. There you can do everything. You can subscribe to our podcast. You can join us in Slack, where we talk about all this stuff and other nonsense. You can even send me an email at stickers@softwaredefinedtalk.com. Send me your postal address and I'll send you back some stickers for Software Defined Talk. So come check us out. Join the community.
Good stuff as always. And folks, as always, thanks for listening to this show. And hopefully you've had a chance to maybe tell your friends about the new one we started, Cloudcast Basics. That's over on all the podcast players these days, and cloudcastbasics.net if you want to kind of introduce some people to cloud computing that are new to it. We'd appreciate if you tell a friend. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up for myself and Aaron. Again, thank you to Brandon. Folks, as always, we will talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.